A war has many fronts, on many terrains. A country must have superiority on the land, in the air, and of course, in the water, if they expect to win a war. Nowadays, the United States is the most powerful naval force in the world, with a total of 430 active ships patrolling the waters. But where did all this power come from? What kicked it off? The answer is John Paul Jones. Jones, also known as the father of the U.S. Navy, took on the insurmountable task of taking on the British Navy during the Revolutionary War. After defeating the French in the 7 Years' War, the British officially took the mantle as the strongest naval power in the world, with an overwhelming force of 270 ships at the time of the Revolutionary War, compared to the meager 27 ships deployed by the Continental Army. There was no competition in the seas between the United States and the British oppressors, but then what would stop the British from funding their forces in the colonies? Again, the answer is John Paul Jones, and although some may argue that John Paul Jones' strategies were nothing more than pirate tactics, so he doesn't deserve to be elected to the APU's History Hall of Fame, he truly does, because of his naval record of more than 16 captured or sunk British ships, and his credit for being the beginning of the most powerful navy in the world. July 6, 1747, in Kirkcudbrightshire, Scotland, Jean Macduff and John Paul Sr. gave birth to their son. Named after his father, John Paul Jr. quickly joined the naval business. His older brother William had already married and settled in Fredericksburg in the Virginia colony, so at 13 years of age, John Paul Jr. took an apprenticeship with a ship called Friendship, whose destination was commonly the Virginia colony. He continued working with the British merchant ships up to 1768 when he became disillusioned with slavery, which was commonly the purpose of his voyages. So in Jamaica, he abandoned the slave ship, two friends, and headed back for Scotland. In Scotland, he found himself as captain of the John after the deaths of both the previous captain and the first mate. He successfully led the ship back to port, much to the gratitude of the Scottish owners. He continued to lead the ship until 1770, when he was involved in a controversy which forced him out of the country. After leaving Scotland, John Paul had a short stint with the British ship Betsy, but after he was attacked by a mutinous sailor, John Paul was again forced to flee. In around 1774, he ended up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he was granted land, a new surname, and a chance at a new life. The newly American man quickly made connections with revolutionary leaders like John Hughes in Philadelphia. In 1775, he offered his abilities in the newly created Continental Navy, where he was granted first lieutenant of the USS Alfred. This was when his naval career truly began. The Continental Navy's first test occurred in February 1776, where Jones helped to plan and lead a successful raid against the British Port Nassau in the Bahamas. The Navy was able to gather many much-needed resources like gunpowder and other arms. After departing from the captured fort, the fleet headed back for the U.S. and capturing the British ships HMS Hawke and Bolton, but failed to capture the HMS Glasgow. Despite the success of the raid, many captains were relieved of their duties as punishment for the escaped Glasgow. However, Jones, who was very successful in the attack against the Glasgow, was given command of the colonial ship Providence, the first of his many successful naval campaigns for the U.S. A big issue for the U.S. during the Revolutionary War was inaction. The vast difference in numbers between the British and U.S. armies caused U.S. commanders to be much more reserved, which put the U.S. almost permanently on defense. John Paul Jones, though, inspired a change of thinking. He sailed for France to secure a ship for his command. After speaking with the French ambassadors, including Benjamin Franklin, who he became very close friends with, his strategic brilliance won him command of the Indian. However, due to the British, the ship wasn't sold to the United States, instead shipping it to France, so Jones had to settle for the much smaller USS Ranger. Despite this, he sailed for the British coasts on April 10, 1778, to cause as much damage to the British Navy and economy as he could. He targeted the merchant ships anchored in Whitehaven, which saw limited success. He then attacked and captured the Drake, a British naval ship, which he brought with him to France. This was the offensive action the U.S. needed to take in order to successfully defend the States and prove to France that the war was a winnable one. Afterwards, Jones was given command of the much larger USS Bonhomme Richard. As a part of an attack by multiple countries against the British, Jones engaged the Battle of Flamborough Head, where his fleet captured HMS Serapis and the Countess of Scarborough. These victories, along with many other battles resulting in the sinking or capturing of British ships, gave the naval victories that the U.S. needed to stay afloat in the war against the British. John Paul Jones very often used a town hopping strategy during the Revolutionary War. He and his crew would raid a town overnight and quickly escape and move on to another town or ship that he considered to be a profitable target. If this sounds familiar, think of the war in the Pacific during World War II. Japan was looking to build an empire leading up to the Second World War, and when it kicked off, Japan quickly spread its imperialism to surrounding islands previously under Western control. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. joined the fight against the Japanese and began a naval campaign in order to reach the Japanese mainland and force a surrender, so they began to use an island hopping method to reach their goal. After capturing an airfield in Guadalcanal, American generals MacArthur and Nimitz began an island hopping campaign to both stretch out the Japanese military and reach an island close enough to stage an assault on the Japanese mainland. Of course, we all know that instead the U.S. decided to use nuclear weapons to defeat the Japanese, but without the captured airstrips in the Pacific, the U.S. wouldn't have been able to launch such attacks. The victory here is an example of how U.S. naval leadership has used John Paul Jones' strategy as a blueprint for more modern naval success, and why Jones is known as the father of the U.S. Navy. John Paul Jones should be in the APUSH Hall of Fame because he provided the naval expertise and victories that no one yet provided for the United States. The U.S. provided him with a home and a new life, and in return, he began the most powerful navy in the world and was one of the primary leaders in the Revolutionary War. If you wonder how the U.S. was able to win the war in the Pacific in World War II, or how we managed to get men on the ground in the D-Day invasion, you can thank John Paul Jones and his strategies.